webinar, Threat Detection and Security Policy in Mobile Networks, sponsored by Juniper Networks. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit your questions to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green Resource List widget. Towards the end of today's presentation, we'll ask for your feedback. A survey will pop open on your screen and will only take 1 minute to complete. Your feedback is extremely helpful. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available about 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I would now like to turn the event over to Heavy Reading's Chief Analyst, Patrick Donegan. Patrick?
Thank you very much indeed, Stephanie. Yes, indeed. Welcome to today's webinar on threat detection and security policy in mobile networks. I'd like, first of all, to introduce my co-presenter today. He is Albert Liu, Senior Product Manager for Juniper Networks. Good morning, Albert. How are you today?
Great. Good morning, Patrick, and everyone who's on the webinar.
Okay, so I'd like to just kind of contextualize the presentation that we're going to give today in terms of some major landmarks or inflection points in the way that mobile security has evolved over the years. If you think back to the very first GSM networks when they were rolled out in 1991, this was the world's first mass market communication system with end-to-end encryption. It was pretty awesome. We then went from there, and in terms of major inflection points, to introducing GPRS and CDMA 2000, and obviously that was the first time that these cellular networks had been open to the internet as such. And so for the first time, we needed to sort of put firewalls at those interfaces at the point where the mobile network interfaced to the wider internet. And that was a kind of a fairly significant move. Other than that, we've kind of moved forward over the years with everything, largely built into standards, largely kind of, pre-done for us from a security perspective, until we kind of got to the LTE era, where suddenly we had encryption terminating at the 3GPP encryption terminating at the node B, and we had an option. Did we want to encrypt the S1 interface? Did we want to therefore put a new security node into the mobile network, a security gateway node? Did we want to put that in? And a lot of operators have, and some haven't. But in terms of the major kind of landmarks, I would say, in mobile security, those have been the major ones over the last few years. We are moving, I think, now to what is a new one, as SDN and NFV are rolled out, as the nature of the threat environment becomes more and more exaggerated, becomes more and more accelerated, I should say, in terms of the variety and sophistication of the threats that ICT infrastructure is susceptible to. And what I think we're moving towards now is a much greater centralized creation of security policy and much more distributed enforcement of detection and enforcement throughout the mobile network. And we're going to talk a little bit over the course of the next 45 minutes or so about exactly what we mean by that and how that can get implemented. So one of the fundamentals of network security is that just securing the perimeter against external attacks no longer works. If anybody finds that surprising or odd, then I'm duly shocked. I think it's a well-understood mantra today. The sophistication of attacks, especially those at the application layer, means that some malicious software is inevitably going to escape detection by perimeter security devices. It doesn't matter how good those security devices are, some attacks are going to get through, period. Like any other network, service provider networks are increasingly vulnerable, therefore, to inside-out attacks, where network elements inside the network become compromised and they then proceed to carry out attacks on elements outside the network. They're also increasingly vulnerable to inside-in attacks, whereby a network element within the mobile operator's network becomes compromised and then starts to distribute malware and infect other network elements within the network, the service providers and network environment. The most obvious example of this is through malware and botnets. Ironically, of course, mobile communications have themselves played a key role in undermining perimeter security throughout the ICT ecosystem. Employees carrying smartphones now move seamlessly between the internal enterprise network and the external network environment. So because perimeter security is no longer enough, network security has to assume zero trust today. If pretty much any network element is vulnerable to being compromised via multiple different threat vectors delivered from multiple different points in the network, then how can you trust any one network element? In the past, a robust security architecture traditionally required the ability to detect and mitigate threats at obvious points of vulnerability, such as critical interfaces to the external internet. Mentioned the GI earlier on. Increasingly, a robust security architecture requires the ability to distribute detection and mitigation capabilities beyond these traditional security hotspots, so that they can be triggered at multiple points throughout the whole of the network. Clearly, if you're distributing threat detection and security policy enforcement closer to the source of the threat, then you're better able to contain the size of the footprint of the attack and the amount of damage that it inflicts. We have some survey evidence here from heavy reading surveys of what mobile operators are reporting to us. In this heavy reading survey, they reported seeing most attacks originating from the internet, as you'd expect. Most attacks are attempting to enter the network via the GI or the SGI interface. But know how 60% of respondents are also reporting seeing attacks coming from the RAN. So we're moving to what I'd call a more distributed security architecture in order to support centralization of security policy as well as greater distribution of policy enforcement. What do I mean by that? The traditional security architecture on the left here depicts the way in which network policy and security policy have tended to operate in almost entirely separate silos from one another, including in the mobile network. Security policy has tended to draw on threat intelligence in order to inform decisions, which are then enforced by a dedicated layer of security infrastructure, by which I mean your firewalls, your IDS, IPS, your DDoS protection, all that good stuff. Even in the traditional security architecture, there's always been a fairly small contribution made by the basic network infrastructure layer to the enforcement of security policy. Most typically, network switches or routers already play a supporting role in DDoS mitigation, for example. That normally means those switches or routers dealing with well-known, low-level threats with easily identifiable signatures, while leaving the more challenging security threats to be dealt with by specialized security gear, such as, for example, DDoS protection stuff. It's important to bear in mind when considering all this that there is more to this than an all-hands-on-deck justification for offloading a portion of lowest-level security functions to the basic infrastructure layer. Your dedicated security products, your firewalls, your IDS, IPS, at the end of the day, do also tend to be a lot more expensive than basic routers. So the more threats that can be dealt with by lower-cost infrastructure, the better. It's notable that in the traditional architecture, the switches and routers that execute on that minor security enforcement role typically do not have direct access to the threat intelligence in the forms of feeds or dynamic information about potentially infected or dangerous endpoints in the network. Instead, they take part in security policy enforcement by being statically configured with access control lists, ACLs typically. The right-hand side of the chart shows the case for a new architecture to improve and grow the role of the basic infrastructure in security policy. There are three fundamental changes in the emerging security architecture as it relates to equipping basic infrastructure elements with the intelligence and flexibility they need to up their contribution to network security. And they're all shown here. First, the introduction of a direct dotted line, if you like, between the security policy environment and the basic network infrastructure. This will enable routers and switches to be programmed to respond to a great many more threats than they can today. Second, virtualization of network security instances. In addition to allowing additional security policy features to be enforced by distributed switching and routing elements for the first time, the architecture on the right assumes that security VNFs are also being spun up and distributed wherever the presence of threats requires them to be spun, more rapidly and at lower cost. So we're talking here not just about supplementing the dedicated security layer with better support in the basic infrastructure layer. Through virtualization of the primary security layer, we're also adding to the flexibility with which security instances instances can be deployed anywhere in the network. And lastly, automation of security policy. Security professionals spend far too much time tied up in routine administrative work. That can't be said often enough. Maybe I need to say that again for emphasis. Security professionals spend far too much time tied up in routine administrative work, configuring firewall rules and goodness knows what else. These guys are so much better than that. That routine work needs to be taken off their hands. They need to be freed up to plot the next phases in the security strategy and try and get ahead of the attacker community, or at least stay on a par with it. A security architecture that's automated as far as possible is critical to achieving that outcome. Let's be clear, security professionals are more jaded than most about automation. Just ask them how many false negatives or false positives they've had to deal with in the last week. But however much promise and reality may drift apart from one another, more than security professionals would actually like, a high level of automation still has to be the goal that the industry marches towards. And we are making progress. Lastly, I want to share with you a slide that arises from a survey that we did just over a year ago of 1997 service providers, a combination of fixed, mobile, and integrated incumbents with both fixed and mobile services. And we asked them to answer this question. Is SDN and NFV, are they mostly a security threat or an opportunity? I've talked about some aspects, one or two aspects of the opportunity. Albert's going to talk more about the opportunity, but there are threats as well. If you open your network via open APIs to third parties, well, guess what? There's a security risk that goes with that. If you roll out hypervisors with your NFV deployment, which you're bound to, you're going to have to deal with hypervisor vulnerabilities, which are a significant issue in the ICT infrastructure generally, and particularly for service providers. So, there are pros and cons. There are security opportunities and risk. And I think the important thing here, and this is a survey that we carried out just over a year ago, is that when you asked service providers, do most of them think it's a threat, an opportunity, or both? You find that the balance, there's an appreciation that both are in play, that it is. SDN and NFV do present both threat and opportunity, but the clear balance in terms of threat and opportunity is towards opportunity. And I think it's also worth stating that this survey was carried out more than a year ago. So I think the trend, the balance in terms of perceptions of risk and opportunity are shifting increasingly and inexorably, I would say, towards opportunity. There are going to be risks. You can be sure there are going to be outages and issues and degradations arising from NFV and SDN deployments as part of a whole teething episodes. But I think the market momentum is moving decisively now in favor of seeing these architectures as offering more opportunity than they do threat. So just before I move on to hand over to Albert, let me invite you, if you would, to give us an idea of what you consider to be the most significant threats from a mobile network security perspective. And there are two really for you to choose from. Do you think that network outages and service degradations are the most realistic threat from cyber attacks? Is it theft, exposure of private customer information? Is it perhaps both of the above equally? Or are you going to say that neither of these are a significant threat? I'm not going to be expecting to see a lot of answers for number 4. My money's going to be that both of the above equally is probably going to come out on top, and I'm going to bet that network outage service degradation comes second, but narrowly. How's that for a very, very, very putting my money where my mouth is? I'd be surprised if I was exactly right about that, but let's just see what you folks all have to say. So do please submit your responses, and we'll see what comes out. And I think I'm going to have a little push on that. Well, there you go. Well, I was right about both of the above equally coming out. That's 57%, the vast majority, a clear majority, I should say, of people said both equally. But actually, where people do think one is a greater risk than the other, isn't it interesting that it's actually theft, exposure of private customer information in this poll comes out as slightly more important than network outages and service degradations. I've done surveys where outages and degradations have come out a little higher. I've done one or two where theft of private information has come out on top. But this is quite an interesting balance. Clearly, I think there's probably one person who said that neither are a significant threat. I think maybe that person was just having a little bit of a joke on us. Albert, any thoughts on this particular survey response?
Well, I would have predicted the same results that you did, and I think it's very interesting that there's more focus on that customer information, and I think that that's because of that assumption that you made earlier that it's more than just the perimeter security. It's the fact that customers are really concerned about the fact bad actors may be in their networks already.
Right, great stuff. Well, with that, Albert, let me leave you take us forward.
Sure. So we're going to talk about the specifics of threat detection and security policy as they happen in mobile networks. And as we look at this general problem at Juniper, we're really thinking about the fact that the threat landscape is changing very, very rapidly, and that it's more than just about the operational uptime. It's also about securing the contents within the network. And you can't look at just the perimeter and just the endpoints any longer. You have to assume that the threats are everywhere. They're going to be coming from everywhere. And at Juniper, we're committed to investment in a vision that helps our customers secure their networks with a combination of both bottom-up and top-down that leverages information in the network as well as enforcement points throughout the network and is driven by intelligence from the cloud. Complexity is definitely the biggest aspect of vulnerability that our customers are seeing. There is a lot of different things going on in the network. For instance, we're taking a look at zero-day attacks. So if we think about a zero-day attack, these are no longer just brute force traumas. These are sophisticated attacks that are multidimensional. In many cases, adversaries are leveraging attacks that they can buy or put together on the internet. They don't even need to have the skills in order to deploy these attacks. We're also seeing attacks that are coming from adaptive malware. The malware is able to look and understand its environment and to be able to essentially hide from those of us that are looking to seek them out. Now we look at the cloud, there's another area of complexity. There's a lot of opportunity that's happening because this is something that enables rapid innovation, and virtualization and SDN allow delivery of new services and offerings much faster than we could do in the past. Of course, the problem here is that our adversaries are able to turn the cloud on its head. While we typically think of the cloud as being a tool for good and productivity, our adversaries are able to use the cloud to deliver massively scalable and disruptive attacks that cost them very little, yet yield maximum damage. And then from an infrastructure standpoint, we have a very, very resilient internet infrastructure. However, we also have very common underpinnings to that infrastructure, and that can result in attacks that can have very, very widespread impact. Sorry, I'm trying to advance this slide. And as Patrick mentioned, the security model, the perimeter security model, is really, really changing. And in the past, security was layered and built on top of this perimeter model. Essentially, devices at the edge of the network served as the defense for all types of threats. So there is essentially trust on one side of the network and no trust on the other side of the network. So everything south of the GI-LAN interface was trusted, and everything north of it, the big bad internet, was untrusted. However, this landscape has really changed. The surface area of the attack in which attackers can mount their attacks is no longer just from the outside internet. They can impact devices inside the network through both social engineering as well as the fact that devices are jumping between different networks, and being able to monitor and evolve and understand these threats requires a lot of adaptability. also requires the ability to take more than just putting a lot of features at the edge of the network, just putting in unified threat management, putting in anti-malware, and assuming that doing this at the perimeter of the network is going to be sufficient is no longer a safe approach in order to defend the network. So very interestingly, now we're looking at more than just endpoints on the network. Everything in the network is a potential threat. So we could use the Internet of Things as a potential example. You might just have an Internet of Things device, say a street light in a city, and it's connected so that the city can have automated control of their lighting. In normal conditions, these devices are going to call home. They're going to supply statistics about energy utilization, make sure everything's running correctly. Hey, is that light still working? But what happens at some point, the light controllers start sending lots of traffic and downloading lots of data at a strange rate. How do you actually detect this? How do you know if it's normal, if it's not normal? Can you do this without any historic information analytics? Can you do it without visualization? You know, you're getting so many logs that you're just ignoring. How are we going to be able to detect this? And then, once you could detect it, how do you actually mitigate that? And that is one of the problems, of course, with perimeter security, that if this is an attack or a vulnerability that's happening now inside your network, the perimeter really can't do anything about that. So we're on to our next poll. And this poll is, how does protection against internal threats from within the network compare, in your opinion, to protections against external threats? And I'm curious to see what the results are. So your choices, of course, are a greater concern for internal threats, as great a concern. Maybe those internal threats are not as much of a concern, or maybe you're just not worried about the internal threats at all. Okay, I'm going to advance and see what our results are here. So this is not what I would have thought. It seems like there's a belief that those internal threats are as great a concern. So obviously you're all fairly well educated about the fact that these internal threats are very, very real. Let's move on here and look at how else do we think about threat intelligence. So one of the aspects that we are, those of us in the security community are painfully aware of is that there is a lot of different companies pursuing a lot of very specialized security intelligence and threat intelligence problems. There's thousands and thousands of them. This just shows you a very small subset of the types of problems that we're trying to solve. There are intrusion prevention and detection systems. There is persistent threat sandboxing. There is deception, analytics for seeing what's going on, next generation firewalls for telling us how we're using applications. They're all giving us lots and lots of information, and we really don't know what are we supposed to do with all that information. And it's all sitting there, of course, at the perimeter, because that's the place where traditionally security has been applied. And now we're going to try to coordinate and understand what's happening. So you're going to get lots of alarms, and we're not going to know what to actually do about this information. And what we'll show going forward is that software-defined secure networking is a way to transform and organize this information each of these components have their own detection capabilities, their own policies, their own thoughts about how to perform this enforcement, and integrate them together in a holistic way that unifies both detection and enforcement and allows for simple common sense policies to describe how to coordinate all of it. So one place to start is in unifying the threat detection and protection in real time. And the threat information that Juniper utilizes comes from our offering called Spotlight Secure, which ends up looking at command and control feeds, GeoIP information, and infected hosts that we see in our network that's connected to our Spotlight Secure capability. Now, our actual feeds that are used to inform us come from multiple sources that we subscribe to. They're curated by hand as well. And we use this to deliver a unified threat score that we can then push down to the perimeter devices that have the ability to understand this threat intelligence. In addition, we have intelligent policy management, which allows us to have our users define what does it mean and what to do with this threat intelligence. And of course, there is the ability, which we'll describe in a little bit, to enforce the policies across the network. This is just for how do we actually do the threat detection. And it happens in a centralized place in the cloud. So the way to start thinking about how do we pull all this together is that it needs to be a change in mindset. So before we were thinking about securing the network, it's us and them, trusted and untrusted. Now we need to talk about a secure network. And in a secure network, you have to come to the realization that, yes, all the information is traversing the network, and that you are trying to identify that information as it traverses the network. But also, there is now cloud information that can be used to identify the threats that are already inside. So the cloud can be used to inform devices in the network about threats that you may not have seen go through the perimeter. Another part of this change in mindset is that the detection enforcement needs to be enabled everywhere in the network. It's no longer sufficient to have this happen at the perimeter. There needs to be a way to have this happen out at the edge of the network. And security itself is a problem for everyone. It goes both north-south as well as east-west. And as we see services getting linked together and networks being more connected, and we're seeing not only more ways for threats to spread, but also more ways for us to be able to stop threats. So how do we look at this? What do we call this? The way that Juniper thinks about this is as a software-defined secure network. So in this type of network, we're operating the network as a single enforcement domain, and every network function in the network becomes a potential place to enforce policy. Policy is no longer just firewall rules, but they're business objectives that have been described to talk about the intent of the business. For instance, we might want to say, well, there's certain classes of devices that we just don't want talking to the public internet. So for instance, that light bulb, that might be something that we said, all right, that's not a type of device, a class of device which is allowed to have certain types of communication. So you're no longer worried about the actual IP network that it is connected to. You're worried about the types of devices here. There's also detection. And detection is a two-way street. Detection happens both at the network, and it's happening with our traditional security devices, but it's also happening in the cloud. So our security devices are just part of the detection. When those security devices send information into the cloud can tell us and inform us whether what we suspected was a threat is an actual threat or not. And if we don't have enough information, we can leverage the economics of the cloud and the capabilities of the cloud to do things like detonation of malware, to understand whether or not something that we saw in the network, but we might not have enough processing power in the network to actually handle, to understand whether or not that's a real threat. And now the cloud allows us to not only inform the network device that actually saw the potential threat, but also inform the rest of the networks that are connected to the cloud that are being secured with this cloud capability about the potential threat if it is one. So it's actually that network effect that happens when you have many, many customers that are participating in the detection and the spread of the information about who the bad guys are out to those networks. And finally, there's enforcement. So enforcement is using that threat feed intelligence, and it's enforcing policies in real time, and we'll get into how do we actually do that in a little bit here. So the first place where we start is trying to understand the actual threats. What we're going to do is we are taking three components for a bottoms-up and top-down approach. And those three components, first we leverage the network infrastructure and ecosystem itself, which includes all the network elements and virtual functions in the network. And those elements can provide both threat intelligence and detect threats. So the first part is those network elements. Secondly, we're going to use cloud-based threat defense, which uses the security intelligence information I mentioned before. And it also includes a cloud-based scalable way to do malware detection. And it's not just detection, but also detonation for malware that we haven't seen before. We can amplify the detection capability in the network by using the cloud. And the third part of the SDSN architecture is a centralized policy engine and controller. That policy engine will dynamically adapt the policy to constantly evolving threat conditions based upon the business rules that were defined by you, the customer. And the controller executes the policy by communicating enforcement of the policy to the elements in the network, including any network functions, both Juniper and non-Juniper. And now SDSN will share and distribute this threat intelligence from all the different sources and can use any point in the network as a way to enforce this policy. So unique in the industry is our way of thinking about how to perform the enforcement of those policies. So on the top, you have different ways in which we can identify threats, and we've talked about that at length. And then the policy controller can use that threat information to inform the enforcement elements in the network. So in the Evolved Packet Core, one of the big challenges is that everything's tunneled. So with that tunneling, it becomes very, very difficult to actually understand how could we actually perform enforcement? How can we perform detection on, for instance, GPPU information, because that is encapsulated. So while you may have the ability to detect some types of attacks that are happening with routers and switches, you may see strange amounts of or volumes of traffic that are going from one place to another, or your policy may say, well, we're not allowed to go from one IP network to another. The detection and enforcement actually needs to figure out how can we get those firewalls acting as good actors for enforcement, not only at the perimeter of the network, but also deeper into the network. So the first place where we start is we start with enforcement on the GI-LAN perimeter. And typically GI-LAN firewalls are very, very straightforward devices which have a limited number, small number of firewall policies. They're essentially deployed just for the hygiene of the network. It's to make sure that you don't have someone doing basic TCP port scanning, that you're not getting lots of malformed fragments of UDP or TCP packets. There's not a lot of sophistication that happens here. However, there's an opportunity to take that GI-LAN perimeter and to look at making it more sophisticated. You can do things like URL filtering, which some of our customers are doing. You can look for malware You can use it to manage antivirus. It's possible to get the GI LAN to coordinate with the 3GPP policy architecture so that specific security services could be offered to specific customers. For instance, you might want to do antivirus only for some customers. There's a lot of opportunity here to get a lot more sophisticated about the security that's applied and analyzed at the GI LAN. Other part of GI LAN is that we can start using cloud economics to get more intelligence. So instead of just being a standalone island, you could have that GI firewall talk to the cloud. We can look for command and control feeds. You can supply your own command and control or GeoIP information. For instance, you may be in a geography or where the regulatory environment requires that you block certain types of traffic, like child pornography, for instance. And then you want to have your own feed, use that feed so that you can inform your firewall, and then you can provide that and use that to block traffic. You can also use it to find where command and control information is coming into your mobile endpoint. And Juniper's Spotlight Secure can inform you about those sorts of threats. And then if you see malware, you won't necessarily have to identify it as such. Just suspicious potential malware, and SkyATT can do further analysis. It can do detonation of the malware in a safe sandbox outside of your network, if that's what you need. You can do this either with physical firewalls with our SRX series or VSRX, which is the virtualized equivalent of our SRX series GI LAN firewall. And then there's a question of, well, how do we actually enforce this? And enforcing happens with that policy engine that's talking to the firewalls at your Evolve packet core, that's talking to Juniper switching and routing. And there's a couple places where this will happen. So one place is at the security gateway, and that is now at the edge of your network. And instead of performing security enforcement at the perimeter, at the very edge of the network, traffic that's just coming in from the eNodeBs, our security gateways can unravel the IPsec, and they can apply firewall policies, or they can apply blocking, they can apply mirroring, they can apply quarantining of traffic. So think of your security gateway as a LAN switch, but for the Evolve packet core, because it's at the very edge of your network. It's able to unravel that traffic and understand whether or not the enforcement that's being requested by the security policy controller actually should be applied, because now we're looking at traffic in the clear. The other place is at mobile edge computing. So in a mobile edge computing scenario, which we'll look at in the next slide, you have the ability to apply enforcement. What we can do is we can use Contrail to service chain in the virtual SRX into a mobile edge computing node. So mobile edge computing is being used to be able to deliver higher quality, more differentiated, personalized services out at the edge of the network. And as part of the mobile edge computing function to do these services, it has to be able to get traffic into a form that essentially looks like the GI LAN, because otherwise there's no way to apply these specialized services. And so all you have to do in order to do detection, enforcement, and to have a place where SDSN can take foot is to have a virtualized SRX firewall service chained in right after the traffic has been fully de-encapsulated. So now you're looking at clear text traffic. There's no GTP, there's no IPsec, and you can look at it with a VSRX and apply detection and enforcement and have an interface to that policy engine. And now you have a highly distributed way in which you can enforce policies at the mobile edge computing site. And of course, this same basic approach, which is service chaining in a virtual firewall into a network service or function, could be used at other places in the network. But the most obvious places are at mobile edge computing, and of course, a built-in service chain, as you were, in the firewall, which is acting as a security gateway. So just to reiterate about Juniper's security vision, for us, we are really focused on going from network security to secure networks. We're the only company in the industry that has the building blocks that exist today to deliver on this vision of software-defined secure networks. And this software-defined secure networking approach includes that policy and management across all network elements to describe what business objectives need to be met and describe it in simple terms, not in firewall rules. We have an adaptable security solution that is able to use and leverage cloud-based economics, cloud-based technologies, and also we are using third-party technologies to look at traffic in real time and to disperse that information out to not only the perimeter of the network, but highly distributed at the edge of the network. And so this becomes a very, very cost-effective detection solution. It leverages the power of networking together many, many networks, and it allows enforcement to happen everywhere across the network. We can dynamically adapt to the threats that are happening in the network in real time, and we can stop those threats as they happen, and we can identify new ones as they appear, and we're able to do this in a way independent of how threats actually arrive at the network. So we have one more survey here.
That's not a survey, Albert.
Sorry.
That's that is the form inviting our audience, please, to give us your feedback on the presentation you've seen thus far. Let me also invite audience members, please, to submit your questions. We have a couple, but we've got a ton of space for additional questions if you'd like to run them past Albert or myself. And we also have plenty of time to get through those questions. So do please submit them according to what you've seen or what your core area of interest is. I'm going to begin with a first question that's come in there, Albert. It's kind of composed of two parts. Are Juniper's SDSN plans only related to mobile security? I kind of suspect not. Let us know. And then secondly, where do Juniper's threat feeds come from? Are they open to third parties, etc.?
Okay, so that's a very good two-part question. And our SDSN plans are actually originated in conversations with enterprise customers. So currently, we are deploying SDSN with many enterprise customers, and the enforcement is a little bit easier because it can happen from routers and switches. So it's not just for mobile service provider networks. The second question is, where are our threat feeds coming from? We have threat feeds that we use that are both open source as well as threat feeds that we pay for. We are open to taking in additional threat feeds, so please contact me if you have ideas about a threat feed that you might have, if you're a vendor who's listening to this, or if you're a customer who you have threat feeds that you think are really important. And we take all those threat feeds in Spotlight Secure, and then we curate them into a single unified threat feed. So essentially our threat feeds come from multiple sources.
Okay, let me put in one more here. Obviously, we've both mentioned during the course of our respective parts of the presentation the importance of automation. I mentioned in my introduction that the security community, you mentioned automation to these folks, and they have a tendency for their eyebrows to kind of head for the ceiling because, as you'll be aware, false negatives and false positives are a core problem in the security environment. Therefore, when you talk about automation, it can't just be automation; it has to be highly, highly accurate automation. What is Juniper doing in order to ensure the highest possible level of accuracy?
So this is an ongoing, this is a problem kind of that never gets solved, right? Because you never get to a complete lack of false positives, just like the world's greatest concert pianists never are satisfied with their performances. So in order to get our customers comfortable with automation, which I think is really at the heart of this question, you can define your security policies so that they don't require you to automatically quarantine or block traffic. We can instead log and alert administrators to what we see so that you can get comfortable with what you're seeing. And also there's the ability going forward to provide feedback so that, let's say that we do create that false positive and we find out, oh, that was wrong, then that information can go back into the cloud and then we can get reinformed back to everyone who got that false positive so it doesn't happen.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm not convinced I see any further questions there. Oddly enough, there's one that's just come in, another one on the exact same question about handling false positives. But I don't believe we have any further questions. Do you have any closing statements you wanted to make, Albert?
Just like to thank everyone for listening to and participating in the webinar. Oh, we have another additional question here.
We do, and it's from a very large service provider in the US, who I'm sure you'd be very disappointed to miss out on asking a question like that. Can you elaborate on how Juniper uses AI, artificial intelligence, to identify and eliminate new types of threats? Wow, well, that's probably a whole day seminar, but what can you do in 5 minutes, Albert?
Well, I'll give a short answer on this. So obviously, there are new types of threats that are emerging, and the question is, what general approach do you use in order to identify threats? So one way that's been done in the past that we still use is signatures. And we know that signatures are not that effective overall because you can take malware and then you can give it a new signature so that you can't really see what's happening, right? However, the behavioral aspects are harder to avoid if you're building attacks, right? Because there are certain sorts of behaviors that we want to understand that are good behaviors versus bad behaviors. And there can also be precursors to bad behaviors. As an attacker, you're scoping out what are the potential vulnerabilities. You are looking for those vulnerabilities in a certain way. And if you are doing it in a particular sequence and a particular timing and then you want to change that, that's where some machine learning can assist, because it can look for, oh, okay, maybe they're not doing it in quite the same order, but we're seeing the same sort of general overall reconnaissance that's happening. It might not be quite the same fingerprint of reconnaissance, but that's one way in which we do things. Also, there's deception as we look to, as we're sandboxing threats. So we try to do the deception in smarter ways to try to speed up deception. So our machine learning algorithms, for instance, will try to speed that up and figure out, okay, what kinds of things cause malware to get its head out from under the covers and show up faster. We do have a bunch of machine learning experts, so I wouldn't necessarily call it artificial intelligence. I would say that we are working on this from a machine learning standpoint to understand how can we be more effective in terms of ferreting out this malware. And it's an ongoing process, and it's kind of like the machine that learned how to play Go. You start training it actually on lots of known malware to start with, and then as you see more malware as you go forward, you can get better and better at this. I'm not a machine learning expert, but my understanding is that generally speaking, there's an ongoing feedback loop that's used to be able to get better and better at the detection of new types of threats.
Okay. Well, I think we're about done. So I'm going to say thank you very much indeed to our audience for participating today. Thanks very much indeed to Albert and Juniper Networks for a great presentation. Hope you've all enjoyed yourselves. Thanks for your feedback. Hope to hear from you again soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.